So we want to talk on the topic of does ego block awakening? And I think this is a really important topic because for those of us who have been involved in spiritual work for days, months, or years or decades, for some of us, this idea that awakening is blocked by ego is pretty deeply embedded in a lot of the traditions that inform modern spirituality. So is it true? Let's take a look at that. First of all, one of the confusing factors is that there's lots of different definitions of the word ego. So we'll start with a few of the major ones. First, we got Freud. The ego is the executive that makes rational decisions and balances desires with social rules. Jung said that ego is the I that experiences life. Um, In common usage, the ego refers to perhaps a sense of self-importance or overblown self-esteem, like this person has a big ego, meaning they're arrogant or something like that. In Eastern philosophy or spiritual context in general, we've got the illusory self, the ego as illusory self, the mental constructs that we identify with, like our thoughts, our roles, our histories, our stories that obscures our deeper true nature. Um, some refer to ego as the defensive, fear-based aspect of personality that tries to protect the self-image and control situations. Some specific modern spiritual teachers. Here's Eckhart Tolle defines ego as mind-made false self arising when the mind is unobserved, a self-concept born of identification with thought, emotion, and form. As he put it, a sense of self that arises when the mind is completely unobserved. Adyashanti defines ego as self-concern and self-obsession, explaining that it arises when we identify with our thoughts, opinions, and judgments, filtering everything through a lens of how does this affect me?
Lots of self-referencing.
Right. And he thinks of ego as a movement, not a thing, which I think is helpful. A movement that isn't static. Instead, it's a verb, a movement of the mind constantly forming and reforming identity. It's the after the fact mental motion arising from thought and emotional reaction. Ram Dass said ego is who you think you are, a constructed personality identified through thoughts and roles. Ramana Maharshi, the ego is the illusory I thought. I am this, like I am the body or I am the mind, which veils the true self of pure being. Nisargadatta Maharaj, the ego is the illusory personal identity, separate from the absolute self. It masquerades as the I am, limited by name and form. So instead of trying to figure out what's a correct definition, let's just look at what's in common between these. These definitions treat ego as a self-referencing mental structure that organizes experience around the idea of me. It's identity focused. It's about defining, protecting, or projecting a sense of self. It's selective. It filters reality to preserve our identity and separate us from things we don't like or don't want to identify with. It's defensive. It's resisting experiences or truths that threaten the self-image or threaten our sense of self in any way. It's separating. It reinforces the idea of me versus not me. It's limiting. It narrows perception and keeps awareness tethered to the personal rather than the universal. So now we're not saying there's anything wrong with any of this. In fact, what we're saying is that discovering ourselves and looking at the parts of ourselves that trying to discern what is self from what is not self is really just part of the process. From our perspective, taking any kind of sort of negative or denigrating view of ego really does not help the situation. And we'll explain a little bit more about that. But how could these various ideas about ego actually block the awakening process? Well, the answer to that is going to be partly about it depends what you think awakening is about. So, in Freudian psychology, the ego's role is to protect the self from discomfort. This can this means we would end up resisting surrender and vulnerability that awakening often requires. The Jungian psychology approach thinks that over-identifying with the conscious small self I limits awareness of the other parts of our being, including our unconscious and the transpersonal self beyond ego. The general common idea of ego as an inflated sense of self-importance has this effect of reinforcing a separation between self and others. Eastern philosophy and spiritual context means that we end up mistaking the ego identity for the whole of who we are, and it perpetuates the illusion of a separate self. And in modern self-help and personal development, the idea of the ego's need for control and validation keeps attention on self-image maintenance rather than direct, unfiltered presence. So, do any of these limiting senses of self actually block awakening to the universal aspect of our being? Now, this is just in the notion that we're thinking of awakening as awakening, not as awakening to the universal aspect of being. We, of course, believe that it's way bigger than that, but we're just starting with that. So we're here to say that no, none of these limiting senses of self could possibly be a block to the realization of the larger truth of our being. And the wave and ocean analogy helps make this clear. Imagine a wave believes that it's a separate thing, that it's distinct from the ocean that it's made out of, and that this wave identity worries about its own size and shape and how it compares with the other waves and what's going to happen when it dies or ends. And so, from this perspective, it looks a little silly, the idea that the wave has its own separate identity. Although it's still true, humans still have this kind of small self identity. So we don't want to say that's not a real thing. We're just saying, when you step back and look at it, the small self identity couldn't possibly be a block to the larger self sense identity because they're both right here in the same moment and they're both equally accessible. What it really comes down to is that this belief that we're just this small human self causes obscuration. It causes us to be distracted from the truth. It causes us to invest our attention in the small self in a way that actually um, distracts us from noticing the larger self that's also equally present. So we're saying it's not a block. It's just a kind of state of hypnosis that we're in. And all that's really necessary to get through that state of hypnosis is a desire to see things from a larger perspective and the willingness to, at least at some points, begin to soften our grip on the identities that we have created for ourselves that are limited and real, but just not complete.
Well, what do
So
you mean when you say they're real?
well, in other words, this is a real thing. This body, these feelings, this mind, my uniqueness, all of these things are just as real to me as the absolute formless being. So what I'm saying is that having an identity of just being this and not also that is a partial and limited kind of identification of who we are. That really, our own being is urging us to awaken to the whole truth of who we are. And that's why, okay, we spend years of our lives trying to figure out who we are in our humanness. But sooner or later, it's just not enough. Sooner or later, we start getting bitten by the spiritual bug, which is basically, I feel like I need to realize something way bigger than this. This just feels way too limiting. I know that part of my being is somehow related to the rest of the universe, but how? And so there is this search for this big awakening into the big self. again, we're here to say there's more than just that. We'll talk a little about that. So this whole thing brings up our definition of ego. Ego is a web of thoughts and beliefs that we build and maintain to resist and distract ourselves from fear and pain, and also to ensure that we're okay. Ego is a web of thoughts and beliefs we build and maintain to resist and distract ourselves from fear and pain, and to ensure that we're okay. So we're saying it's just kind of this lump of stuff that we originally created in our reaction to pain and discomfort as we were growing up. And because it was the best we could do, horrible things happen as we were growing up. We experienced lots of pain and fear. And we really, because we're not being properly accompanied a lot of the times when we're growing up, we don't know how to deal with this in our system. So we go to our head to try and figure out what's going on so we can figure out how to solve this problem. Well, the problem can't be solved on the level of mind. The problem is overwhelming fear and pain. It can only be solved by being comforted and accompanied when we're infants. But if we're not getting that, then we end up trying to figure out what's going on, and we end up in our minds going through this exercise that never ends and never produces a resolution to our real problem. The real problem is we weren't given enough love and accompaniment when we were young, in a sense. And but it's not even a problem. Another way of looking at this is that everybody goes through this. It's not that something is wrong. It's that we're learning to how to live as the universal in a human body and how to love ourselves and each other while we're doing that. And we're definitely not all there yet. And so the problem is we're really looking for love and wholeness, and we don't know how to get it. So, you want to talk?
Yeah, I'll say ego, it can feel like a ghost from the past that is always telling us how bad, unworthy, fearful, how wrong we are, how diminished, how messed up we are, alone, unloved, worthless, and how worried we are. Or it tells us how good, wonderful, amazing, smart, loving, and special we are to compensate for feeling the opposite so much in our lives and in the past. Either way, it can feel like a hungry ghost, like that yapping voice that we mistakenly take to be who we are. We are not that thing, but we can't be at war with it or it strengthens its intensity and comes back even more strongly. We can remind ourselves, it's not me, this is not me, and that can help.
Mhm.
Our addiction to this web, as Ted called it, leads to us mistakenly identifying our sense of self with it simply because we spend so much time absorbed in it and obsessed with it.
Right. Whatever we spend a lot of time immersed in, we end up identifying with when we're younger in the process because we don't have a way to hold the wholeness when we're young. So we just kind of get with the parts and we kind of merge with the parts. Nothing, again, nothing's wrong. It's just that our capacities for holding wholeness haven't fully developed yet. So as long as our attention is exclusively absorbed in this complex web of thoughts and beliefs, our awareness is not free to notice that our personal wave is part of the ocean of impersonal, formless being. And so the ego can't block this form of awakening. It's just, again, a distraction. So, how do we get past this distraction? How do we get past this challenge of being absorbed in our false sense of self? Because that's the real issue that's trying to be addressed with the various ways of thinking about ego. Well, there's kind of three major approaches out there that we've all heard of. One is kill the ego. Another is transcend it. And the third one is embrace it. So the kill the ego approach, it also comes through some approaches in Buddhism that are about cutting through the ego. So if you believe that the awakening is about getting to the infinite at all costs, then it makes all kinds of sense to just sort of take an enormous ice drill and drill right through the ego. Don't care about the ego, it's just a thing that's in the way, and go for the thing that's under it. This suggests the belief that the ice is never going to melt, or that we don't actually have contact with what's under it, despite the fact that there's ice on top. Neither of which is really true, but you can start to see how this is really coming from a place in which we believe in our separation from the totality of being. So many spiritual schools consider ego the enemy of awakening in this sort of story, in this drama of the awakening process. Ego is the problem. And, so if ego is the source of our lack of enlightenment, shouldn't we just want to push it out of the way or blast it or whatever it takes? So to us, that's like saying, well, if we're addicted to television, then the solution is to kill the television. And we're here to say, no, that really doesn't make sense. The television isn't the issue. If you kill the television, then the next time you want a television to distract you from things you're feeling that you don't like, you'll go buy another television.
I mean, I just want to share that this is what I did for a long period of time, constantly trying to kill the ego, constantly trying to get rid of it, feeling like it was blocking me from really awakening to the totality of the truth of who I am. So I totally understand this
Yeah.
piece.
So from our perspective, what's really going on that the real, if there's an obstacle here, it's our addiction to identifying with mind.
Yeah.
It's kind of like an insidious inner TV channel that's always saying, you need to believe me, and if you don't believe everything I say, you might die.
You will
You
die.
will die. That's right. It does that. And so out of fear, we're like, oh, okay. I have to believe everything my mind is saying about this. And it's not even the beliefs. It's our belief that there is a belief that will save us. It's our belief that our mind, that being in mind and figuring it out is the path. And we're here to say that's not the path.
Because we have all been educated and conditioned and trained to believe that what we think is who we are,
Yeah. So, um,
or that we have to believe the mind at all costs.
yeah.
Yeah.
And part of this is from the old, like, we think therefore we are, which was a misinterpretation of what he originally said anyway. And it's not true. Whether we're having thoughts or not, we're still here. So it's not about that. Killing the ego, the bottom line is that killing the ego isn't possible without killing yourself. And even if you could kill your ego, that wouldn't solve the problem of our addiction to mind. So, what about the transcend the ego approach? Well, if awakening is about somehow getting around our human self-protective tendencies, then ignoring those tendencies and focusing on the infinite, maybe that would do the trick. If only the pesky ego would simply just stop distracting us from the transcendent. So then you got these modern spiritual schools, which include folks like Tolle and Ramana and Nisargadatta, all talking about how they talk about dealing with ego. Tolle talks about cultivating present mind awareness to become the witness of thoughts. This egoic mind is dismantled when you observe its internal commentary. Ramana says practice of self-inquiry, consistently asking, who am I or where does this arise from, dissolves the I thought, allowing the luminous self-awareness to remain while the ego fades. Nisargadatta said, direct attention to the primal sense of I am, inquiring into its nature, and recognizing its origin beyond the personality is the ticket. Awareness of your true being frees you from the ego's illusions. Well, we're here to say that, yeah, we're not objecting to any of that. We're here to say that these are important steps to learn how to go beyond the activity of the ego and our addiction to mental activity. To be able to watch and witness our mental activity is a very important piece. But is that enough? Because what does that do? For an occasional person will take this to its extreme end and realize that the absolute self is untouchable and can't be harmed by anything that happens in mind, emotions, or body. And that person might be lucky enough to have a sustained and stable awareness or awakening into infinite being. But that's pretty rare. Honestly, it's quite rare that that happens. And even when it does happen, unfortunately, it gives the realizer the impression that that's it. I've reached the peak of the mountain. I've reached the peak of human evolution. I am the infinite, and that's all there is. But that's not all there is. And that's why it's also important to consider what we mean by awakening. We're here to say that awakening isn't just about consciousness. In fact, I spent 10 years defining the I conscious model, which is specifically there to show us that who we are is comprised of a bunch of layers, not just consciousness. Consciousness, soul or uniqueness, mind, emotions, and body. These five layers of our subjective sense of self are all present and need to be integrated and incorporated into a whole sense of self, not split into consciousness versus humanness. Because when we split that, that we're not fully awake. Maybe we're awake to consciousness, but the way I define it in the I conscious model is that the I consciousness realization we were talking about, wherein, you're just that, and that's supposedly it. The result of that is a fundamental split between the divine and the human, which is actually where most of humanity is living in their belief, which shows up in our religions, a fundamental split between God and humans. And we're here to say that's not the full awakening. The full awakening must include both as one, because that's the bigger truth that we come to realize. It's all one thing. So next, the third approach. Okay, if we're not going to kill it, if we're not going to transcend it, how about we embrace the ego? Well, if you believe that awakening is about discovering the unity between your human self and the infinite aspect of being, then embracing our humanity is a really good idea. The more embodied school of awakening, including Trillium Awakening, are getting into this, recommending that we embrace our humanness, including our egoic tendencies. And frankly, this is true, even though very kind of hard to accept for people who are deeply steeped in a more Eastern approach, because it seems like allowing ourselves to drop down in and identify with our humanness is like identifying with the plague that is causing the problem. If our humanness is the problem, then identifying with it seems like the wrong direction. Yeah. What do you want to say?
Well, I don't know that I agree that we have to identify with it, but we have to allow what's there
Okay.
for me.
All
Yeah.
right. So, indeed, this kind of embrace of our humanity does help us drop into ourselves and awaken into the unity. But there's still a catch. As long as we continue to identify with the egoic sense of self, even post unity awakening, and this is what generally happens, then we're still not realizing the ultimate singularity of our personal and universal nature. So it's like, yeah, we figured out that there's a connection. We even experience directly in unity consciousness. We experience this connection between self and universe. but we're still not fully resolved internally. There's still a way in which we hold ourselves separate, even if it's subtle and hard to detect, which it is subtle and hard to detect,
Yeah.
especially in unity consciousness. So we're here to offer a kind of radically different suggestion about how to work with ego. We're here to suggest that, um, first of all, our definition of awakening includes whole being, all those domains that I mentioned, and it even includes the self that's part of relationship with other people. So it's all part of who we are. And what we're proposing is that instead of saying that ego is a problem or a bad thing, we're saying ego is a cry for help. Ego is the part of our being that's saying, I didn't get enough love. I didn't get enough safety. I need to attend to myself because I don't feel safe enough or strong enough to handle being a creature in this world. And so, what if we actually help ourselves fulfill the needs that give rise to these egoic tendencies? These tendencies that are really just there to help us and protect us and make us feel okay. So we're saying, let's not dismiss that and try to get around it or kill it or just like hold on to it as if that's going to solve our problems. None of that is ultimately going to bring us to what we call living in flow, very advanced stages of awakening in which we're living without resistance to what's happening. Well, how can we get to living without resistance to what's happening? We get to that by experiencing resistance, discovering that it in itself isn't actually happening, isn't actually helping, and fulfilling the parts of us that need love and safety and awareness of our connection with each other and the world. So we're saying, yeah, don't push any of that stuff away. There's a reason why all of this stuff keeps coming into our awareness and our attention. It's like if a small child came over to you crying because it was hurt, would you say, you're too needy, go away? No, you wouldn't do that. That wouldn't be helpful. Same if your own inner child comes to you looking for your own assurances. Don't push that away. Love yourself. Learn to give yourself the love that you didn't get enough of. Learn to give yourself, find ways to discover the security you need to stand in yourself and experience whatever life has to give.
Yeah. And I truly believe at this point in my life that love, when we don't know what to do in any given moment, love, love ourselves, love whatever's arising for us. Um, that is the healer. Love is the healer.
And love and safety and awareness of self and awareness of everything brings us the wholeness that we're really searching for. So I think that says what we were trying to say. Hopefully that helps you understand a little better that there's ways that we can cooperate with our own egoic tendencies and use that as part of our awakening process.